Welcome to the Clarice Smith Distinguished Lecture Series. It's an opportunity to offer new insights in American art as we welcome the perspectives of noted artists, critics, and scholars. I might mention that Clarice Smith, who funds this program, is an artist herself, as well as an Emerita Commissioner of the Smithsonian American Art Museum, and we're so grateful for her ongoing support. I'm delighted to introduce Aruna D'Souza, a noted critic, who writes about modern and contemporary art and also focuses on how museums shape our views of each other. Her most recent book, Whitewalling, Art, Race, and Protest in 3 Acts, was highlighted as a best art book by the New York Times in 2008. She writes regularly for such publications as the Wall Street Journal, Garage, Art News, and Book Forum, to mention only a few. She is the co-curator of an upcoming retrospective on the work of Lorraine O'Grady for the Brooklyn Museum, which opens in March of 2021.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much to Director Stevish and her colleagues at the Smithsonian Museum of American Art for inviting me to deliver the first Clarice Smith lecture. It's a very exciting honor, and it's a very new thing for me to be sort of standing up here as an art critic, because my training started me out for many years as an art historian, and I made the transformation, and I really think of it as a real transformation from historian to critic only about 4 years ago, in fact. And in part, it was because I was very determined, and I felt urgently the need to speak to contemporary politics and the transformations of our political landscape that were happening around me. And so my work has turned into a bit of a hybrid between writing about culture and writing about the, things happening in the world that I feel very urgently about. And I very much appreciate the opportunity to do that tonight for all of you. So thank you very much. And I will go on. In May and June, in the wake of the killing of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and the rise of a protest movement that swept the country and indeed the world, museums began issuing statements of solidarity, what Holland Cotter has termed "we must do better" statements, acknowledging that much work had to be done to combat systemic racism in the US, including at their own institutions. Some of these statements were quite general, expressing agreement with the general principles of diversity, inclusion, and racial equity, while others, sometimes under the duress of their staff's own criticisms of institutional practices, outlined actions they vowed to take with varying degrees of specificity to clean their own houses. What they all had in common was this. First, they were suffuse with the language of empathy, emphasized the need for understanding across divisions of race, and stressed that museums were uniquely placed to help nurture or foster that understanding. The message, ultimately, was that art is the language that connects us. Second, they called attention to issues of visibility, of the need to show more artists of color, to hire more Black curators, to foreground issues that were urgent to African Americans. Some were even accompanied by images of works by Black artists in their collection, so much so that Glenn Ligon, in a moment of frustration at the way his work was being instrumentalized, wrote on Instagram, "I know it's #National Reach Out to Black Folks Week, but could y'all just stop or ask me first?" Neither of these things, the emphasis on empathy or the emphasis on visibility of Black artists, audiences, and museum professionals, is particularly surprising. Cultivating empathy, the ability to relate to another person's experience, or more specifically to their pain vicariously, has become the goal of many museums in the past several years, a period in which political divisions have fostered a kind of emotional coarsening in this country, a devaluation of human life, a tolerance of other people's suffering. But while this very important human trait may indeed be in short supply these days, focusing on it, I believe, is not a meaningful path to the kind of racial justice that is desperately sought and long overdue in this country. Today, I want to talk to you about a number of concepts that I think are interrelated: empathy, translation, and visibility, to think about the other ways of understanding political transformation. The connections I'll make are sometimes direct, sometimes glancing, a matter of intuition as much as analysis, but perhaps that is enough. I will start not with an artwork or a museum exhibition, but with a book. Amitav Ghosh's 2008 Sea of Poppies is an experiment in storytelling. Is it possible, the author asks, to build an epic story around the very problem of linguistic and cultural opacity? Can we imagine a situation in which the Tower of Babel could be built, in which cooperation could occur even in the face of the cacophony of languages spoken by its builders? What, that is to say, are the narrative possibilities of mistranslation? And, as a not insignificant corollary, what are the revolutionary possibilities of mistranslation? The reach of the novel, the first of a trilogy that includes River of Smoke and Flood of Fire, spans the early 19th century globe, a period when the opium trade was fueling the British economy and mapping geopolitics. The story follows the Ibis, a ship that has made its way from the Americas, where it has picked up a free Black man passing for white, along with goods produced by enslaved laborers on plantations, to England, where raw materials are dropped off and new merchandise laded, around the coast of Africa, across the Indian Ocean, and eventually to Calcutta. The opium being cultivated by sharecroppers in Bengal will, it is planned, eventually be dropped off in China against the wishes of that country's leaders, who rightly see it as a means by which their citizens are made docile and beholden to European colonists. Along the way, the ship adds and sheds crew, who are known collectively as Lascars, a word that implies something like pirate, a hodgepodge of Europeans, Africans, Chinese, South Asians, and Blacks from North America and the Caribbean. Out of the many languages each speak, they forge a commonish tongue, Lascari English, a pidgin patois full of loan words and salty curses, and the necessary lingo to keep the ship afloat. It is the book's narrator tells us, a motley tongue spoken nowhere but on the water, whose words were as varied as the port's traffic, an anarchic medley of Portuguese, Calalooses, and Kerala Patamars, Arab booms and Bengali ponchways, Malay proas and Tamil catamarans, Hindustani pulwars and English snows. Yet beneath the surface of this farrago of sound, meaning flowed as freely as the currents beneath the crowded press of boats. It is a language, in other words, not tied to land or country, but to movement, migration, trade routes, and the space between. When the ship arrives in Calcutta, the global port city does not disappoint, linguistically speaking. Ghosh here introduces characters such as Bengali peasants who are eking by under the thumb of opium traders, a French botanist and his India-born daughter who is more comfortable wearing saris and speaking the local dialects than wearing dresses and conversing in her mother tongue, muckety-mucks and functionaries in the British East India Company, even an elegant, well-educated Maharaja. Each speaks or fails to speak any common tongue. Even the Englishmen, who claim to have a monopoly not just on opium, but on civilization itself, speak a form of English that has been so transformed, enriched or mangled, take your pick, by Britain's imperial adventures that it is barely recognizable to the reader. The Maharaja speaks a language that perhaps sounds to readers' ears most like our own, but this ability to communicate with us does not grant him any special power, as he is consistently misunderstood by the English businessmen who have fixed the rules of the game and who only hear through the lens of their arrogance, greed, and self-interest. Language is revealed to be untransparent, a maze or obstacle course rather than a smooth pathway to human connection. What makes this book illuminating to my mind is the author's refusal to translate for the reader. We are left to muddle our way through the dialogue in the same way as the characters, understanding wisps and threads without any feeling of fluency. The only way of comprehending what is happening is to abandon the frustration that might come from not being delivered a fictional world fully available to us, and instead to float on the words the way a ship might float on the water. Sitting with incomprehension is an uncomfortable act. For those of us whose first language is English, it's also an unfamiliar one, given the way in which our preferred system of communication has been imposed on the world as a norm. But in Sea of Poppies, our discomfort isn't futile. Even if we don't understand everything, we end up understanding enough to follow and ultimately enjoy the story. Likewise, even when the sailors and rulers and colonials and peasants interpret based on an imperfect grasp of what the others are saying, sometimes wildly misreading a speaker's intent, that creates no impediment to the narrative. The narrative goes on, ending with an event that will eventually change all their lives. The endless misunderstandings contained in the narrative create spaces where characters are able to insert their own desires and urgency and move forward together. Revolution as a form of misprision. Empathy is a concept based at its heart on misunderstanding. Empathy is a concept based at its heart on understanding, the ability to translate the experiences of one another into one's own language. The language in question doesn't need to be a linguistic one. It could be gestural, embodied, tactile, or many other ways of communicating. In a moment when so many of us are hoping for a degree of revolution, some form of change to whatever extent to our increasingly intolerable lives, many have imagined that increasing empathy is a means to such an end. This has been especially true since the 2016 presidential election, when liberal pundits realized with horror how many people were willing to vote for an outspoken white supremacist, a misogynistic, homophobic, transphobic, ableist, and otherwise hateful man. And they doubled down on the idea that empathy was the key to a more progressive political arena. Love trumps hate became the rallying cry post-election, as it had been during Hillary Clinton's campaign, a slogan that placed personal obligation to understand each other at the heart of a politics of resistance. It has continued as a banner under which this so-called resistance has organized in the wake of Trump's inauguration and in the subsequent months and years. It was premised on the idea that a greater understanding of the experiences of marginalized people would lead the US to a more perfect justice, more humane political leaders, fairer laws and less bias and punishment, fewer police shootings of Black and brown innocents, and generally less racism in our daily lives. Empathy is one of the things that makes us human and is a deeply important quality to cultivate. The problem with imagining it as a useful tool for political transformation, however, is twofold, as the example of anti-Black racism demonstrates. First, as the work of Ibram X. Kendi and others demonstrate, racism did not come before institutions. Institutions created the need for racism. Racist ideas about Black Africans were concocted in order to justify slavery. Slavery was not the product, but the origin of the many racist ideas that emerged in Europe in the 16th century on. As institutions such as slavery continued to structurally place Black-skinned people in a debased position, racism became naturalized, practically invisible. Now, hundreds of years into the project of white supremacy, we must not fall into the trap of imagining that changing attitudes, cultivating empathy for the oppressed, will undo structures. The structures need to be undone in order to clear the conceptual and imaginative space for empathy to flourish. The second problem with considering empathy as a political tool is simply this. I don't want to wait for individuals to develop empathy for me until I am treated as a full human being. I don't want the fullness of your humanity to depend on my capacity for understanding. Empathy is a personal transformation, not a collective act necessarily. It replaces political revolution with atomized notions of doing right by others. And when it is the basis for collective action, it can do as much harm as good. The colonizing projects of European empires and the Catholic Church in an earlier moment of globalization were motivated, or at least justified, by empathy, after all, by wanting to save people from their own darkness. A politics based on empathy imagines justice as something to be bestowed by newly enlightened individuals on other lesser individuals and communities. If there is a politics in empathy, it is one that allows the person called on to be empathetic to remain in a position of supremacy, doling out justice as a matter of kindness. It also, to come back to the issue of language, hinges on an impossibility. Just as some part of meaning gets lost in translation, so do parts of ourselves as we are forced to translate our sense of being into another language or definition of personhood. This is the violence at the heart of becoming a psychological subject that Jacques Lacan elaborated 3/4 of a century ago. And it is a process that requires us to submit ourselves inevitably to the authority of a governing language. Empathy doesn't take into account that which overflows the translation of the other into the terms of the self. It works to contain, or if containing fails, to reject that excess. Camila Jahan Rashid speaks of the leaky sentence, a form of communication in which meaning spills out, overflows, cannot be contained. If the sentence is a device that holds unruly words together, a leaky sentence maintains the unruliness. If the sentence is an atomized form of order, the leaky sentence represents disorder. If the mobility promised by global capitalism depends on containerization, being able to carry things in an efficient way, the leak is inefficiency, that which slows down and resists such a shuttling of people and their labor across the world. The ibis, the ship in Sea of Poppies, doesn't leak as such. A leaky boat is its own sort of problem. But it leaks in other ways. It sloughs people, depositing them around the world, sometimes against their will, as in the case of indentured laborers or those who have been enslaved. At other times, against the will of the ship owners, as in the case of the Lascars, who regularly disappear once their pockets are lined with earnings or of stowaways. Ports are some of the leakiest geographic sites, places where borders become porous and often unpoliceable, no matter how much one tries to fortify them by building walls or fences. The Calcutta that Ghosh describes in Sea of Poppies is a place of leakage. Here, languages slosh around, mix and dissolve, and yet in this chaos, solidarities emerge, momentary alliances based not on empathy, but on imperfect understanding of others' motivations, desires, or values. This seems to me the most important lesson of the book, given the times in which we live, in which we find living under the conditions of late capitalism and creeping fascism untenable, but we have been so divided and atomized, so individualized by the state, that empathy becomes not merely impossible, but starts to act as a deferral of revolution. Change will come when we understand each other better. rather than a means of transformation. To be able to act together without full comprehension, to be able to float on the seas of change should be our goal. In museums, we believe comprehension comes from looking, that looking leads to understanding. There are exceptions, of course. Some work is premised on our inability to see, but I would argue that often these are exceptions that prove the rule. But what if invisibility is a trap? What if visibility is a trap? In an interview in 2017, In an interview in 2017, Camila Janan Rashid cautioned about what is lost as historically white museums and other institutions try to make visible what they have been guilty of making invisible for so much of their histories. We are at a point in history when visibility and inclusion are often conflated with radical change, she says. If I hire a Black person to be a screenwriter on my show, then radical change has occurred. If a person from a marginalized community who doesn't traditionally get to be in the spotlight gets their 15 minutes, then whoa, radical change has occurred. I'm really interested in interrogating visibility as a concession, as a premature celebration, because visibility in and of itself, without the rigor of analyzing why certain people were invisible to begin with, is limited. It is much more productive to think about how individuals can become not the first and only, but the first of many. She goes on to say, there is a lot of focus on always showing your hand and always telling people what you are doing, always asking for hypervisibility as a radical move. But a lot of the radical work done in movements prior to our generation was not necessarily done through hypervisibility. So I'm interested in how we can think about not so much hiding, but strategic opaqueness, refusing to be legible. To frame this demand for legibility and visibility a different way, in terms of the settler colonial logic on which the countries in this hemisphere are built, I turn to another thinker, the Indigenous music scholar Dylan Robinson. In his new book on Indigenous sound, Hungry Listening, Robinson notes that when the Stolo people in what is now called British Columbia first encountered white settlers in the mid-19th century, they dubbed them the Hungry Men, in part because they were starving, literally starving, and in part because they were driven by a craving for gold. Likewise, in other native languages, whiteness was also associated with what could be thought of as an extractive logic, a desire to take from this land and its people what it needed to satisfy its selfish desires, to consume without thought of consequence. So then, keeping these two ideas in mind, what if our desire to know, to empathize, to see fully is a form of this extractive logic? In this historical moment, when we live in a surveillance state, when police, instead of pursuing cases in which their peers have murdered Black and brown people, pore over social media pictures of protesters in order to identify them so they can harass or charge them unjustly, what does the visibility of Blackness in our cultural landscape and the desire on the part of institutions to make Blackness more visible, what does this imply? I'm interested in this question and interested in how a number of artists are complicating or interrupting the very idea of visibility, of the way Blackness can be defined and understood and therefore become the object of our empathy. Sandra Perry, interdisciplinary artist who works with video, computer-based media, and performance, has spoken about her interest in how Blackness shifts, morphs, and employs technology to combat oppression and surveillance. This agility is hauntingly apparent in Double, Quadruple, etc., 1 and 2 from 2013, an eerily silent 2-channel video loop. On adjacent screens, 2 performers, the artists Danny Giles and Jory Minaya, dance. each against the corner of a white painted room. Using the content-aware patch tool in Photoshop, which enables the removal of unwanted elements from images, Perry has covered over almost all of their bodies. Flashes of brown skin and the constant presence of braided hair keep the performers from dissolving into pure abstractions. But they elude identification. We cannot see them, even as we cannot tear our eyes away from them. Nick Cave, an artist who for decades has been addressing Black history through costumes that render the body all but invisible, likewise presents a Blackness that cannot be pinned down, that confounds definition or fixed form, while at the same time acknowledging the ways our culture projects its worst fantasies and fears upon it. In Blot, from 2012, a figure clothed in one of the artist's signature sound suits composed of layers upon layers of fringed fabric, inspired in part by West African ceremonial costumes, is mirrored around a central axis. The by-turn smooth and sudden movements of the performer transform before our eyes into a succession of Rorschach tests. We might see faces or skulls or birds or African masks over the course of the 43-minute video. Even the sound is multivalent, produced only by the fabric of the costume brushing against itself. It is at the same time oceanic, like waves lapping the shore. Look closely at Jennifer Packer's 2011 charcoal drawing, Swim. Against a sea of black marks, a finely drawn rope, knotted at one end, dangles from the top edge of the composition. Look closer still and you will see 5 white spots of bare paper, interrupted by a few quick dots and lines that you will soon recognize as the head, hands, and feet of a swimmer who has likely just swung from the rope and landed in the splash of water. Packer draws with negative space, allowing the figure to emerge from a field of black, barely deploying line at all, and using the side or flat top of the crayon to block out everything but the face, body, rope, and a thin slice of sky. But the artist infuses these formal decisions with an emotional weight that reveals the contradictions of Black life in America. The pleasure of jumping into a cool pond on a hot day and floating weightlessly on the water coincides with something more ominous, the relentlessness of the dark field that defines the swimmer's body, and that rope dangling down, which thank goodness ends in a knot and not a noose. To celebrate such a moment of Black joy is a resistance to a culture that feeds on Black death. In this drawing and her oil paintings, Packer depicts the people she loves and honors: friends, family, fellow artists, writers, and curators, in a manner that insists upon their full humanity, precisely by refusing the propensity of traditional portraiture to serve up those depicted to the viewer's gaze, no matter how impressive or powerful they are. To paint a portrait that respects a sitter's full subjectivity is, paradoxically, to reject making them fully, even clinically, transparent to vision. And so Packer's portraits are both startlingly intimate. Their informal poses, domestic settings, and facial expressions record her own close relationship with her sitters, at the same time as they are hard to grasp. The figures often merge into or barely coalesce from their backgrounds. The sketchy, even agitated lines Packer employs in their depictions obscure as much as they reveal. In Jess, 2019, her friend's crossed legs barely register as such, and the hands that rest in her lap are a miasma of interlaced fingers. Lost in Translation, from 2013, shows bare knees, breasts, hands emerging from an inchoate ground of ochres and browns. Sometimes insisting on the sovereignty of her subjects involves withdrawing them entirely from view. As our television screens and social media feeds fill with images of the corpses of people who are victims of extrajudicial police murders, Packer presents us with an alternative image of the lives that were ended. Works like Say Her Name from 2017, done in the wake of the murder of Sandra Bland, offers up bouquets of flowers whose play between representation and abstraction is almost impossible to parse, that honor the lost by insisting on the fleeting and ungraspable beauty of life. The Black woman's body is, in the racist culture of the US and beyond, a site of many conflicting projections, a vessel of white fears and fantasies. The works that Simone Lee puts on display do not at all shy away from that fact, not least because they are literal vessels at the same time as being figurative objects. No Face bronze, which you see on the left, is a smooth ovoid resting on a dark burnished columnar neck made of bronze. It's made of bronze and it has no face. Peer into its hollow head and you will find only a velvety, seductive blackness. In No Face Panier, on the right, the top half of a woman sits upon a raffia-covered steel armature that functions and plinth simultaneously. Cast from a live model and showing the telltale signs of fingers working on clay, the figure communicates both vulnerability and strength, with sagging breasts and wrinkled abdomen and the effects of gravity's pull around the navel, all arranged in a superhero's power stance. This resilient body is crowned by a head festooned with small, stylized porcelain rosebuds in shades of cream, ecru, pale gray, and pale orange. But as with its bronze counterpart, it lacks a face. The chasm of its head contains more blossoms, clinging to the interior like the most enchanting barnacles, or like the crystalline shards that reveal themselves upon cracking open a geode. Lee's glazed, salt-fired stoneware face jugs trace their lineage to early African American pottery traditions, and even further back to West African and Greek and Roman classical sculpture. In an interview from 2015, Lee said that the face jugs of the Black diaspora were, quote, made to look ugly to ward off evil spirits. But if there is an ugliness in her versions, it is the form, it is that of the most jolie laid variety. Head with cobalt comprises a head set on a thick neck with a footed base, a curved handle emerging from the back of its skull, and a flared opening at the top. The latter element turns this object into a vessel, while at the same time functioning as a crown. Its features, the two that it has, are unmistakably African: wide, flat nose and full lips, marks of beauty for some and derision for others. There are no eyes for this face to see, no ears to hear. The pot is glazed black for the most part, but examine the flared opening and you will notice the edge and the interior are dappled in milky white and cobalt blue, the result of the sculptor's labor-intensive salt firing technique. That same white and cobalt is finely spattered on the outside of the head and along the edge of the lips. The effect is cosmic, a metaphor perhaps for the realms of knowledge and imagination, as plentiful as the stars, that Black women have carried with them over generations and across oceans in order to persist and survive, to maintain cultural traditions and ensure community. The Village Series number 4 is a smallish bust, not quite 18 inches high, sitting on a wood veneered cylindrical column, head on columnar neck with the same mouth and nose as head with cobalt, but now softened. Its slightly matte, creamy white surface is covered with holes ranging from tiny pinpricks to smallish perforations in an irregular pattern. Reading at once as freckles, pockmarks, and the Milky Way, the pitting is repulsive and gorgeous, the very definition of sublimity. A crown of ropey braids tops this head. This braiding appears in a number of Lay's non-representational works, bell-shaped cloches that seamed with plaits, braids. These two are part of what Lee calls her village series. The slippage between bodies and architecture alluded to in the title of a series comprising both figurative and abstract forms. Is a village a collection of people or an accumulation of dwellings? This is reiterated in the 10.5-foot tall cupboard 8, which adopts the raffia over steel structure familiar in Lee's oeuvre. The work's appearance and title point to, among a number of other things, an actual restaurant in Natchez, Mississippi, built in the shape of a giant grotesque mammy figure. You enter it by penetrating her sculpted skirt. Lee removes the entrance. Her version of this edifice is impenetrable. Here, it is surmounted with a stoneware torso whose head takes the form of a tipped-over water jug and whose hands are glazed to a glossy shine as they make a gesture of offering. Although vessels, the figures who populate Lee's show cannot be filled with the imaginings of whiteness because they are already replete. Faceless or eyeless, in declining to return the viewer's gaze, they resist being cast in others' terms. The result is a singular beauty, one that is nakedly and poignantly exposed, but that insists at the same time on maintaining its own boundaries, guarding against its right not to speak or answer, existing independent of others' expectations or requirements. The artist has said more than once that her work is for Black women, a statement that I read as a commitment to holding space for people who have been marginalized in myriad ways by the art world. Lee is creating work about and for Black women that is, at the same time, more than enough to satisfy the rest of us, even as it withholds its secrets. Her sculptures embody an act of refusal that is at once defiant and generous. They will not see us and will not allow us to see them in their completeness, these anonymous, sightless beings, but they still allow us to experience their intense, visceral beauty. A fair trade, it seems to me. And so I will leave you with this. What would it mean for museums to pivot from a strategy of cultivating empathy and understanding to one that leaves genuine room for misunderstanding, for mistranslation, for invisibility, for not requiring artists to offer up their full selves or those of their subjects to audiences who, it must be said, are largely white, to the white gaze, that is to say? How must the logic of the museum and its understanding of what constitutes knowledge mutate in order for Black and Brown and Indigenous and other marginalized and minoritized artists to be able to fully be part of the art world without having to expose themselves entirely or lay bare their secrets? Because this, it seems to me, has to be part of the work that we do, artists, critics, curators, museum administrators, gallerists, everyone in the art world, in order to truly transform the museum into a space where equity and justice is possible. Art and art making shouldn't have to be a constant process of explaining ourselves, of a means towards empathy and understanding. Sometimes, perhaps most of the time, art can be something that we never fully understand, something that our misunderstanding is precisely the pleasure and the radicality. Thank you. I like the use of the word amends in that question, because I think that one of the things that I think that one of the things that a lot of our institutions, not just museums, but we're all thinking about museums. I think the thing that a lot of our institutions want to imagine is that one can just change a few institutional policies and things will be fixed. And I think that many more people are understanding that whatever the institution is, from the museum to the very largest institutions of our government or our state even, that we need to be operating not according to a mode of sort of fixing policies or making small changes, but actual institutional transformation that begins from a very honest accounting and a deep understanding of the ways in which our museums, our historically white museums, have really functioned in many ways to maintain and even promote white supremacy, and ironically have often used the language of diversity and inclusion in order to promote that idea of centering whiteness, right? And so there's this thing that I think you can trace, that a lot of museums will show this Black artist and this Black artist, but really they're putting the resources towards that's all in order to make possible doing a massive show about a white artist, right? Like, we know the ways in which that happens institutionally. We can trace that in our own institutions or in institutions that we're interested in interrogating. We can see that happening. And so the reason I like the word amends is because it leads us to questions that I think are really important, questions of reparations, and thinking about a reparations model for institutional transformation. And that means not just adding, African-American staff, the work of Black artists, exhibitions by Black artists. It doesn't simply mean adding on to existing structures. It means actually remaking structures so as to avoid the kinds of exclusion that happened in the past. So I do think, I'm a big fan of counting heads, and I do think that, there's truth to what, a number of Black historians and political writers have said, that if an institution in this country is, disproportionately staffed by white people in the positions of decision-making and power, it is by definition a racist institution. And how can you say that, right? Like, how can you just make a blanket statement? Well, any institution that is benefiting from or passive in relation to existing structures of exclusion of minoritized communities is also benefiting from that exclusion. And so therefore, according to the logic that you can't be just not racist, you're either racist or anti-racist, it means that, museums that don't employ enough people of color in decision-making, in programming, in powerful positions in their institutions are benefiting from a system of white supremacy and are therefore racist institutions. And if you start from that premise, if you start by just naming that and saying, you can nuance it all you want, but if this is the case, then it's the case, right? If you start by saying that, then I think that a lot of decisions then get made for you, right? So what's the first thing you do? You start examining your hiring practices and you start hiring people with different kinds of expertise and different backgrounds and different educational experiences and different professional experiences, and you start valuing certain forms of expertise differently, and all of those sorts of things, right? So you start there, but you also don't bring people into institutions and have them thrown into structures that are that have historically been hostile to their presence, right? You also have to start examining the ways that that you do, that you do business. Basically, you have to examine the ways in which your expectations are built around people who sort of look and sound and have been educated and have been trained and have been mentored in certain ways, and you start examining whether those are absolutely necessary in order to produce the best work. And I think in many cases they're not, even though we tell ourselves they are. So I think that I think that just in terms of how the institution operates, I think that's one way to start. I think another way to start is thinking about what we ask of white artists, white male artists, what we ask of their art, what questions we ask their art to address, and ask whether we're leaving space for other artists who are not white men to ask similar questions. Like, can we imagine being able to show the work of an artist who is Black and who makes work that is as formalist and obdurate as a Donald Judd, for example? Can we imagine leaving room for an artist not to speak about their identity, not to speak about politics, not to speak about political transformation or Black lives or anything like that? Do we have the space for that? Are we creating a space for that? Do we always need that work to be? Do we always need the work of artists of color, of Indigenous artists, of minoritized artists across the board? Do we always need that work to be in teaching mode? Or can we sit with the idea that, people can make work that is asking entirely different questions, and we have no, and that is still valuable for us to look at, right? If anyone, tells me that Donald Judd is worth looking at, then what I want to know is, why aren't we showing the artists? Why aren't we showing more of the artists who are involved in a very inward-facing exploration of their craft, right? That doesn't answer these needs that institutions have. I think there's a big problem with institutions using artists of color and minoritized artists generally to demonstrate their commitment to diversity without actually allowing those artists to speak to the diversity of their thought and their ideas. So I think that there's lots of ways, at the same time, I think that, Black artists right now are producing some of the most complex and intense and really meaningful political art that we've seen really in, I don't know how many hundreds of years. So, I think that, those two things aren't mutually exclusive. I'm just thinking about the ways in which we need to start thinking about what the art, what rises to visibility within museums in this country, and whether there are different standards for visibility based on institutional needs rather than artistic urgencies. That's a really good question. how important is art in creating a better world? I think it depends on the person who is asked to imagine the world's recreation. I mean, I think through art a lot of times. Like I look at things and I look at things and it gives me ideas for other things, right? I look at things and I start thinking about the way our world is organized and what the imaginative possibilities of a new world are. What could the world look like? And to me, art is a really great vehicle for that. For other people, I think literature is a great vehicle for that. I think for other people, political writing is a really good vehicle for that. I think there are lots of different ways. So I think that art is as important as any other cultural utterance for it. It's the one that I prefer to think about. I think that it's one that is in some ways more accessible because it allows a space for interpretation, for imagining, often that that is productive. But I think that we put a huge amount of pressure on art and on artists and on art audiences if we try and portray art as somehow the way of transforming the world, right? Because sometimes art is just comes from personal urgency. Sometimes it comes from a need to escape. Sometimes it can come from so many different places, and it offers people very different experiences. So I think that there's, I'll say this, I think it's true. I don't think there's ever been a revolution without artists involved. I think artists are often at the center of that, and it's partly because they give us the opportunity, the space to reimagine what we think we know. So in that sense, I think it's very important, but I think that not all artists have to have the pressure placed on them of transforming the world. I think that that's everyone's responsibility, and sometimes we are obligated to take that up, and sometimes people aren't. And so yeah, that's my answer to that question. So certainly there are gestures that museums make that are so clearly performative, right? Like, we can go back to these solidarity statements, right? These "we must do better" statements, and say, like, it was pretty galling to see some of these statements coming from institutions where that they're either not hiring people of color, or they're hiring them and treating them terribly, or they haven't shown a Black artist in years or ever. The Metropolitan Museum put out a statement. At the same time, they hired their first, Black curator in 2019, right? Like, so it's hard, so in some contexts, those gestures are, that the gestures of solidarity statements are, really transparently performative, right? But then there are other, institutions are made up of people, and all of the people aren't necessarily signed on to the larger ideology of the institution, right? So you do have, institutions where curators, often curators of color, not exclusively, but often, are doing fantastic, really thoughtful shows. And yet, because those shows are being housed in larger institutions who have not done enough towards racial equity, those shows or that work is seen as part of the performativity of the institution, right? So that, so you know, that it gets subsumed into that category of performative solidarity. And I think that the only way that one gets around it is to keep doing the work, so that it no longer becomes understood as performative, that it can then be understood as a kind of consistent, deeply thought out sort of a transformation that has happened over time. I think that, you know, part of it is that, you know, museums have been so exclusive for so much of their history, and then suddenly they all get woke in the last, I don't know, 10 years, 5 years, 2 years, 6 months, who knows? But they suddenly get woke, and then they want the credit, right? They want the credit, and it's like you've not shown yourself to be trustworthy over time around this issue, and now suddenly you do one thing, and you're upset that people are calling it performative. But I think that that's the price one pays for not having paid attention sufficiently over the course of time, or, you know, in the case of some museums, having had moments of you know, sort of radical reflection on race in their history and then seemingly forgotten it. So, you know, I think that the important thing for curators, for people who work in the museums to do, is do the work that you believe needs to be done, that comes from your own experience, perhaps as a person of color, or that comes from an immersion in artistic communities of color, and do the work that needs to be done, and keep doing it until people can trust that it's not performative, that it's not one-off, that it's not sort of a punctual need to address, you know, something that everyone's worried about now that will disappear in 6 months or a year or a few years, right? That you know, that there have been lots of moments in which people have spilled out into the streets and protest, and yet a year later nothing has happened. I think the equivalent happens for museums. There are lots of moments in which everyone decides that that racial justice is an important thing, but it hasn't caught hold in a way that feels enduring. And so until that happens, I think the danger of looking performative, like you're acting in a performative manner, is always there. I think that, you know, as long as you are listening and understand and confident that the work itself is genuine and rooted in a really thoughtful understanding of the political moment, of the artists that you're working with, of the artistic terrain in which you're operating in, then you just keep doing the work and hope that that builds the kind of solidarity and goodwill that I think is desperately needed right now. Well, I think that there's two ways of asking the question, of answering that question. One is to think about the individual donor who wants to make an impact, right? Make a positive impact. And certainly there are donors who have stepped up at various museums and really done that, either by targeting their donations to acquisition funds, you know, specifically for artists of color, or encouraging museums to do specific, you know, to focus on, you know, thematics or issues that they find very important and that align with the intellectual project of the museum. Obviously, that has to be a conjunction of interests. And you know, and there are, you know, there are a lot of examples of this, of ways in which individual donors have really allowed for, made space for museums to pursue projects that they may not have been able to pursue, to expand their collections in ways that they may not have otherwise had the means to expand them. And of course, the terrible thing about museums coming late to the bandwagon in some senses when it comes to collecting the work of artists of color is that buying that work now compared to buying it 20 years ago, 30 years ago, whenever, it's a lot more expensive to do that. And so it really does become a financial question as well that museums are solving in different ways, right? Including by deaccessioning some works to collect works of underrepresented artists to fill out their collections. So on the one hand, you know, there's that question of individual donors sort of stepping up and trying to use their money in ways that work to serve these larger issues of equity in the museum. Of course, the problem with that donor model is that, you know, it's as likely as not that you'll have donors who are offering resources to museums to, you know, potentially like to block those sorts of equity strategies as much as support them, right? So donors who might be interested in donating funds in order to reinforce canons rather than expand or explode canons, right? So I will say, and this makes me sort of very out of step with a lot of museum professionals, I think that the donor model, you know, of the philanthropic model of museum support in the U.S. is a thorny one. It often works in detriment as much as in support of the ways we want our institutions to transform. Then there's the other question of how museum boards are structured and the ways in which museum boards and you know, we're starting to talk about this more. We're starting to sort of understand it more. The way that museum boards actually sort of introduce complications to the staff's desire to transform institutions, right? So that, you know, ultimately it's not curators or even the museum director who is signing off on major exhibitions, but it's a museum board that's signing off on these things. And if your board is, you know, all white, if your board has collections that are very canonical, whether they're historical or contemporary, if your board has a sense of conservatism, of a distrust of the transformations that staff might be interested in making, that's also an issue. And so I think that, you know, diversifying museum boards has to be a priority, I think, for institutions. But, you know, again, it comes back to the question of, you know, a lot of inertia comes from people who are in our society at large, comes from people who are benefiting from the system, right? And so if your museum boards are filled with people who have, very rich people who have benefited from the system, you know, no matter what their individual backgrounds are, that's, you know, that often becomes, you know, it becomes impossible to imagine the board structure as allowing the kinds of transformations that I think museums need to enact and make on their institutions. So somehow, you know, this impossible task of creating the activist museum board or the radical museum board, I think, has to be on everyone's mind. That's such an interesting question. Um, and I think that that is, in a sense, the question of the moment, right? Certainly, there has been a lot of struggle to think about what, how we deal with history when that history is one of, that's suffused with racist ideas, right? And otherwise hateful ideas. And I think that one of the things that becomes important is, and this is where empathy does come in, right? This is where the empathy of the curator, I think, comes in. We're often, without even understanding how, and without even sort of recognizing that we're doing it, we often think about museum audiences as an undifferentiated mass. We think of the audience, right? The audience for artwork. And often that undifferentiation, whether we know we're doing it or not, imagines that undifferentiated audience as raceless, right? Which is another way in the United States of saying white, right? White is the race that doesn't have a race, right? Everyone else is marked and whiteness is unmarked. And so when we think about putting things on display, I think a lot of us are often thinking about explaining and giving context to an audience that, may need to learn about our racist history. And the question is, how does that hit for an audience who may not just know about the racist history, but experience racism in their daily lives now on a, and literally on an almost daily basis, right? So I think that, this certainly isn't a blanket solution, but I think that at least some part of the problem could be solved by asking ourselves, not what will the audience think, how will the audience respond, but how would a person who is Black respond? How would a person who is Indigenous respond? How would a person who is Latinx respond? Whatever the case, right? What does it feel like to be confronted with this? What is the value for that person of being confronted by this? And so then it becomes a question not of, is this an important part of our history, but is this a part of history that is important to show to this person or this group of people? And the answers then become difficult because then you start thinking, at least in my experience, okay, well, I don't need to show this, but what's missing then? Like, what do I want to show this, this particular sort of demographic of audience? What part of this history, of this historical moment, is important to show? And so I think, like, that actually, instead stepping away from thinking about audience and stepping away from thinking about history and thinking about audiences and thinking about histories becomes an important part of that process. I also think that, we're so, we can ask this question of objects or images that are overtly racist, but as people, like Fred Wilson, like the artist Fred Wilson, has been showing us for decades, so much of of what's in our museums, so many of those objects have been produced in a way that cloaks the racism of its production, right? Portraits of slave owners, or you know, silver that was made in the same forgeries that were making slave shackles or whatever it is, right? Like that so much of those histories are hidden. And I think that, you know, at the same time as we have to be careful about what it means to show racist imagery, I think that we have to be careful about showing imagery that isn't on the surface racist, but encodes a lot of racist meaning. And so, for example, the Worcester Museum of Art made this very quiet intervention of including in the biography of in the wall labels explaining the biography of their portrait subjects, including their ties to the slave economy, right? And so, you know, I think I think those two things have to be balanced, right? That we sort of are focusing on what it means to show racist imagery, but there's also this question of what it means to show images that are not overtly racist, but are sort of tied to a whole system of structural racism.